Jim Tananbaum is back on the program and joins us today from Los Angeles. He's the founder and CEO at Foresite Capital, a multi-stage healthcare and life sciences investment firm with over 3.5 billion AUM. Before founding Foresite in 2011, he co-founded Geltex Pharmaceuticals, acquired by Genzyme for 1.6 billion, and Theravance, which went public in 2004. Jim, welcome back.
Nick, it's so great to be back. It's hard to believe it's been 8 years. Feels like 30.
It does. We've seen a lot in these past 8 years. Well, it's good to see you again, and it was fun catching up before this. Last we had you on the show was 2018. So bring us up to speed. You know, what's changed about Foresite? What's changed about the thesis and your focus over the past 7 years?
Wow, 7 years. Boy, it's been an eternity. So let's see. First, when we were talking back in 18, the markets were steadily improving. We were, full blown in what became a boom cycle. And life science generally was thriving, as well as biotech. Life sciences being defined as the tools that are used by researchers and developers in generating the biotech products. Then COVID hit and the world went to a screeching stop, but then it rebooted around healthcare. So we had a boom, then an abrupt bust, and then another boom in the second half of 20 and 21. Really anything that touched COVID, got a lot of speculation. And we saw companies like Moderna hit, I think, 100 plus, maybe to even more billion-dollar market caps. Pfizer, I think had its peak price all around the vaccines. And we certainly had a number of things that rose in the bubble of COVID, and then interest rates started, and that has just had a profoundly negative impact on our industry. And the reason for that is anything that's long dated, like really long dated, like biotech investing or long-term healthcare investing, you start applying an interest rate that is 5%. That's just so far beyond anything that anybody had ever thought about. It over a 10 or 15 year period of time, it changes your multiple by 3 to 4 fold.
Yep.
So we saw, a 75, plus percent compression across the boards in all of the way that people were valuing our enterprises. So that, that's led to a lot of rethinking over the last few years about how to finance the types of companies that we work in, but also how to help the companies that were financed prior to that survive. And a number of them haven't, but a number of them will. But no doubt the very difficult financing environment will impact performance for, sort of funds that are vintage year 2021, that sort of run right into the 22, 3, 4, 5, interest rates. And then in the background, there's been AI. Mm-hmm. And AI has been a theme we talked about 7 years ago. And, it becomes a theme that I think, the world is waking up to, but we're still incredibly early with regards to the impact that it's going to have even over the next few years. So I think that's going to be a macro theme that really pervades the venture capital markets as well as the public markets. And that is yet, to play out, except for at the very, very top end, with large tech companies.
Good. So I know that you've always had this strong data orientation as a firm, and your website even says that we use a data science driven approach to invest in companies that leverage biology and big data to transform healthcare. Tell us a bit more about that. I mean, clearly there are advantages in this new tech wave that we're in, but unpack a bit about this data science based approach to investing.
Well, 7, 8 years ago, we tried to systematically do both company sourcing as well as company analysis using a combination of in-house MDs and PhDs coupled with tools that would help make them more efficient. The fact is that the tools back then weren't good enough to have a huge impact on our investment performance. And I would still say that the tools are evolving today that would have a huge impact on our investment performance, but it's been something that we've aspired to over years. And then we measure objectively, and objectively it hasn't led to, I don't think, increased performance as of yet. But I think that it has led to some very, very exciting startup companies that we're involved with that are, I think, changing the performance curve or beginning to change their performance curves. And I do believe it will make its way into our investing framework. And, we continue to revisit that. It's just still early days. And then simultaneous with large language model tools and automation and other things that we've looked at internally, we also had a program where we absorbed global data and looked at genetic patterns and other things that we could pick up. And we were, I think, to the best of my knowledge, really the only investment firm that's set up to do that. And that target validation work that comes genetically does help us gain confidence in things that we invest in. I wouldn't say and actually has driven some investments that we've done. I wouldn't say that it's a dominant factor right now, but when you couple that with what large language models should be able to do and the type of automation that, should be able to be done, I'm hopeful that over the course of the next year or two, we'll have a new member of our team that is AI powered. But that's still right now something that's on the drawing boards.
Good. And I know you do a share of public market investing, but what is the primary entry point, for VC for the firm? Are you investing mostly at Series A and B?
Yeah. So we have an early practice and a late practice. And the early practice tends to go at startup level for things and helps assemble companies. We have an incubation platform called Foresite Labs, which is really centered around large-scale AI incubation works, and Xaira, Xaira, which was a product out of Foresite Labs last year, would be an example of the type of builds that they aspire, to do. So we have some that we bake ourselves internally with a bias towards the internal work being done at Foresite Labs. And then some that we work with entrepreneurs that we've worked with for years as they start up companies. And there's really nothing, Nick, better than a great entrepreneur to get behind when starting something up. And then there's a late stage practice that we have that also tracks entrepreneurs that are in our network, as well as other companies that we've come and looked at. And that late can be, pre-public, it can be public. And there we're looking for real products that we can wrap our arms around as being best in class in their respective categories. And there we've had a very consistent record. We've been doing it for years. And frankly, in this market, it's a fantastic market to be investing in that type of category because the market's so compressed that you're really getting to invest in later stage, sort of opportunities with a lot of risk taken out of the conversation at pricing that, was full, risk pricing of a few years ago. And when the markets recover, and they will recover, they always do, those will be the first to really help demonstrate the returns from the cycle. So
is that the bull case on investing in biotech currently? And you mentioned the interest rate environment. That's creating some headwinds for long cycle bets. But I guess the counterpoint is it's a good buyer's market.
Yeah, it's a great buyer's market. It's not just a good buyer's market. It's almost an unprecedented buyer's market for later stage deals. And then there's another factor that is worth mentioning as well, which is China. And China has really put together a first-rate biotech effort. And one way that could manifest itself as Chinese companies growing up as global pharmaceutical companies, and the Hong Kong Stock Exchange is starting to have a boom now, and that's possible. But there's another way that could manifest itself, which is the way that it had been up until recently, which is that the assets coming out of Chinese companies can be bought by U.S. biotech companies. And that's been a really interesting source of product for the venture capital industry as well as the pharmaceutical industry. The major capital sources and the expertise in growing and building biotech companies still is in the United States. So it's led to an opportunity effectively for those companies to buy products more efficiently than it would take to set up the build in the U.S. And there's been some talk about creating regulation around that. And I personally think that would be a huge mistake for American competitiveness, because then all those products would just go to Europe and other places around the world. And there's no stopping the innovation that's going on in China. They've outdone us in terms of their being able to produce for low single digit millions of dollars drug candidates. But over time, America, can outcompete China through AI and next generation technology. And that's the way the free market works. So hopefully, the regulatory side of this won't, get involved in confusing free market effectively from what's been going on.
So if you buy or license an asset from China, does it have to go through a new set of clinical trials here in the US, or is there a set that's similar in China that, you can get some sort of equivalency on here?
So China's clinical development it has until recently, been a question. So if you're buying something in China, you want to, if you're doing it based upon something that's preclinical, you want to, validate all the preclinical work. But the preclinical models and stuff that they do over there in the very best shops are now first rate. There's still a wide variation. There's a lot of, crap all around the world, that gets done. But at the very highest levels, China's preclinical quality control is, at standard with the best global quality control standards. Now, clinically, China over the last year or so has made a real concerted effort in Shanghai and a couple other places to put together very high quality phase 1 and phase 2 clinical, sort of frameworks. And I believe they're going to generate very good data. They have all the right quality controls around them, and we've started to work with some of them and been pretty impressed with what we're getting out of it. Now, the FDA, being a global, will accept data globally, but wants to avoid bias. So, if you're taking data from China, you have to take it from other places, and the quality control standards have to be, very, very high at every place that you're taking the data from. And the FDA, also needs to, be able to inspect sites and other things. So there are barriers when you get into registration that make you not want to necessarily, lean into China. Although some global pharmaceutical companies are, now as much as maybe a quarter of their registration trials, coming out of China. But again, that requires, very, very strict quality control in order to, pull that off. But I think the big picture trend is that China becomes a very good place to do product development through phase 1, phase 2, and then you can buy the assets at that stage and then develop them globally. And that's been, sort of the trend over the last couple of years.
I guess while we're talking about the FDA, there's been some turmoil there over recent years and some uncertainty. How are you thinking about underwriting trials, commercialization, et cetera, when, the guardrails and the goalposts seem to be shifting?
Well, so first I'd say that what we've done across the board is just try to, work with our companies to have a very high data quality standard and a very high standard for registration work. And that, I believe, trumps everything. I happen to believe that this FDA administration is going to be a good one. And frankly, there's a real chance that they end up approving products, more products than, previous administrations have done. Time will tell. But there's no doubt will be variations in the way that they operate over the way that prior administrations have operated. And at the end of the day, you want to, sort of get out from under that noise with quality. So, I think just investing in doing things right goes a long way with the agency, and also goes a long way in between, various administrations there, sort of staying above the nuances of subtle changes that are made.
Jim, you've mentioned AI a couple times on the show. We talked about data. Talk to us about how you think it may impact different phases of risk, throughout the biotech process. From drug discovery to clinical trials to preventative care, et cetera.
Yeah.
Tell us more about how you're looking at AI and its impact there.
Well, ultimately, you'll have drugs designed completely by AI. Now, are we 3 years away from that or 10 years away from that? I can't tell you. That's what Zera is aspiring to, and isomorphic. And those are very big bets. They require, the right level of capital investment in order to pull off the effective infrastructure that's needed to, move from the physical reality into, the virtual reality, and a place where, there's a lot of still art that goes on in drug discovery. But it's our belief that with the right amount of data and the right people that have expertise and, the biologist and the AI engineers are on equal footing and can talk and work with each other properly, that over the course of the next, reasonable number of years, we're going to see drug discovery move, into an completely AI setting. And that will be very exciting. And what that will mean is that will short circuit the great amount of time that's spent testing stuff in a lab and doing all the work that gets you to a product that goes into man. It's also over time, I think, going to be easier to pull out the populations that are affected by a given disease driver. And as global populations get sequenced, and that's something that's starting at scale for the world right now, that will be easier and easier to match patients with products. It will also, as the world gets sequenced, be easier and easier to pick up disease risk at an individual level, because our genetics determine our disease risk, but then also the change in our genetics determine whether we're developing cancer. And so those are things that can be picked up through routine blood work, and that will help pick out disease at a much earlier state, get us into a prevention framework so we as individuals know, like, I have risk for cancer, so I need to screen more frequently, and I have risk for a heart attack, so I need to lower my cholesterol, more aggressively. And I think that will be the major driver for longevity across our population. And, I do expect to see using these tools where you can push off disease, getting to a, 90, mid 90s, like as a, healthy, sort of target age for the population. I think we're going to see that in our lives. And that's huge. That's 10, 15 years of longevity, beyond where we are right now.
Yeah. What else needs to happen on the healthcare side there? Like you've mentioned sequencing, population, seeing how biomarkers are changing. It still feels very episodic to me. If I'm good, I'm seeing my practitioners once a year and getting my tests, but are we going to see kind of more consistent, persistent measurement models so that we can in real time identify, abnormalities?
Yeah. I mean, look, at the end of the day, I think that, we now have at our disposal the tools to help us all catch disease a lot earlier. And for many diseases, we can eradicate the disease or push it way off if it's caught early. So then the burden becomes, a combination of how much do we want to push ourselves to gain access to those tools as a consumer, and how much will the healthcare system, make it easy for us to, gain access to those tools. And I think the latter conversation is going to take some time because, healthcare is very, very slow moving, and reimbursement, sort of cycles are very long for healthcare. But nonetheless, it's the right thing for the world, and the truth usually is a sticky thing. And so over the course of the next 10 years, I do believe that these tools will be increasingly adopted as part of mainstay healthcare. For example, the Grail cancer test, which is now $900 a test, when it's $400 a test, and when there's more data that shows that it picks up half of undiagnosed cancers and is highly accretive for people that are in the higher risk, sort of cancer category, which, is a very sizable amount of the population, that becomes routine, for people that are higher risk. And we're still, a few years away from that. But those types of things, again, will have an enormous impact on picking up cancer earlier in people. And same with heart disease. Europeans just lowered their LDL requirements substantially. And that's probably the right thing for the whole population, because there's very little downside to lowering LDL further than the current American Heart Association guidelines. However, there's, 8% of the population that really are the ones that really need to lower their cholesterol. So, over the course of the next few years, with genetic testing becoming more pervasive, and like a genetic scan will be tens of dollars, it should be part of the routine, sort of healthcare data that's collected. But then, an individual will know, hey, I'm at risk for heart disease. And then it, becomes a combination of the burden being on the doctor and the individual. But you don't need to manage this on a quarterly basis, or even a semi-annual basis. Once a year, is will pick up a lot of stuff. And so then, if you're not, if you're just ignoring this altogether, that then you probably life expectancy is probably going to be more in line with where life expectancy is today. And
Yep.
and the world will get educated on this in the same way that they got educated on cigarette smoking. And I think over the course of the decade or so, populations will start to adopt a different mindset, and it's not a huge burden. So, doing something once a year, not a huge burden. So,
I'd love to get your quick input on the payers in the insurance companies. So price per test for a variety of things is a huge factor. And as that drives down, that's going to be a big motivator. But we've seen just in our portfolio, we do a fair share of healthcare, mostly software investing. We've seen motivation from the payers to push solutions down to their populations that really, drive down overall cost of care, especially for high acuity patients. Are you seeing that as well? Is that becoming more of a strong trend in the industry?
good question. I wouldn't say that it's a strong trend, but I would say that it is a trend, and payers are playing around with this. We're still not seeing, sort of broad early adoption, of technologies that are accretive effectively to the system. We're seeing, barriers to demonstrate accretiveness that take years to work through. But there are, more and more plans that are on the early adopter side than have been. But I would say that it's not going to change the physics, of having to do very expensive long range, pharmacoeconomic or genetic economic, sort of studies.
I see. So you've invested in many companies, some of which were big winners. You founded some companies that were big winners. As you think back and look back to investments in companies like Hims or 10x Genomics or Verona Pharma, can you tease out maybe some of the lessons that these winners revealed about platform risk, reimbursement risk, team risk? What are some of the more salient takeaways?
Okay, so, I think the biggest takeaway as a fund manager, and I think this is a place that is a little counterintuitive. So you have a company and it's up 10 times your money, but you love the management team, you love the growth prospects, you think the product is best in class by far. And yet the instincts are, well, I'm up 10 times for my money. I can't get up another 10 times for my money. So, time to sell. And that's the way that I think the vast majority of the world, ends up managing things. There's another mentality and framework which basically says, no, I want to keep the winners. I want to hold the winners and continue to ride those winners, because 10 times is a good predictor, that there's another 10 times. Again, it's a market size conversation. But I would say that, something that those companies for us were companies where we love the management teams. The execution's been excellent. The markets have been big, and we had really great appreciation. And we just decided to hold the winner. That was a winner in the portfolio, and we were going to ride it for a while. Now, when you make that type of a decision, you have to continually revisit. The question: are the conditions, the assumptions that I'm making all the same? Management team hasn't changed. Well, that's a big one. But sometimes, markets slow. So for example, with 10x Genomics, the market, sort of just topped out. And then on top of that, over the last year or so, NIH funding has gone through a huge change. So there've been a number of, sort of things that ultimately hit the upside, of that company. Whereas with Hims and Verona's now being bought, so that was, sort of played out until it got bought. And, I have to be careful about promoting public stocks, but at the end of the day, I think the management team in Hims has done a fantastic job growing that company, and they're best in class. And every quarter they continue to beat their earnings, and sometimes even adjust them up. And there's no end in sight to the scale of that company. So that would be, I think those are the I'd say the simple framework we look at, when we're trying to figure out whether or not something really gets into that winner category.
So you mentioned like the 10x exit and, hold, sell. Talk to us more about how you think about generating liquidity in a, overall sluggish market, and how one sort of engineers some DPI when they have a winner, but they're facing some of these tough decisions.
Yeah, interestingly, we ended up distributing. So first, as a fund manager, you're also, constantly weighing getting money back to people. And there's two ways you can get money back to people. One way you can get money back to people is with cash, and the other way you can get money back to people is with an in-kind stock distribution. Our threshold to doing in-kind stock distributions are high. And, but with both 10X and Verona, while 10X was rising and Verona was rising just over the course of this year, we did in-kind stock distributions because we felt there was upside. And I think we distributed Verona at 30%, where it ultimately ended up getting bought. So people held the stock, they got a nice, sort of reward for holding the stock. The flip side of it is it was distributed at around, I think, 14 or 15 times cash. So it was, a good ride for those that, wanted to sell the stock. But, we were dealing with a lot of uncertainty in the first and second quarter, and something we thought was a really, sort of a good performing company against the backdrop of, not having a lot of distributions over the last, couple of years or so. So, we kind of decided, all right, well, the right thing to do here is to distribute get some money back to people, but do it in a way where people can, effectively, democratically decide what they want to do at this point. And if anybody called and asked me, I would say I'm holding it, and so, but that's a real pressure we live under. The flip side of it is we wouldn't be distributing that stock, in the first quarter or the fourth quarter or the third quarter, when we were under a lot of pressure to distribute that stock. But at that point in time, it was 5x appreciated and not 15x appreciated. And we still felt that there was a huge, way for it to run. So we have a number of public stocks in a portfolio right now that we've held on to for quite some time. And, those have been a big, we feel big potential, sort of upside, but yet not realize that upside. So rather than, sort of taking chips off the table prematurely, we're in long-term locked up vehicles. We get paid to hold stuff, and, people are really looking for cash on cash returns. So that's the way that we're managing it, despite the fact that people are also looking to get steady returns. When
you say that the threshold for in-kind distributions is high, does that mean on a multiple basis, or what exactly does that mean?
Generally. Yeah. I mean, I think that if you do something in kind, you're certainly going to want a lot of volume there, so people don't, get hurt if they decide to get out of something.
I see.
So if we have something that doesn't have a lot of volume and it's time to get out of it, we'll spend a month or two whittling it down in a way that doesn't affect, minimizes the impact on the stock and maximizes our liquidity in the situation, and we'll just get the cash back to people.
Jim, I was reading about 10x Genomics recently, and they were flagging a tightening academic funding environment. Do you expect tool and platform companies to face like a demand air pocket as research budgets contract?
Yeah. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty there. The research, I think that the overhead, sort of conversation is going to evolve and no doubt go down. Whether that expresses itself in other ways so that the same tools are bought, I can't tell you for sure.
No crystal ball over there, Jim?
Yeah. But what I would say is that we're more biased these days towards software, than hardware. I think as big a player in the genomics, tools, as well as genomics data interpretation, sort of products, as well as other, sort of research and development and diagnostic, sort of categories. But I think that stepping back from it, the hardware's just, been a difficult place to be. And if there are a couple players, you're, in a race to the bottom. Whereas the software and things that AI, can do open up a lot of leverage and a lot of scale. So, so we're more biased to be looking at the software side of the conversation these days than we are the hardware side.
Jim, if the slowdown does materialize, like what would you suggest for founders with regards to, pricing, packaging, financing strategies in order to kind of weather that slowdown?
I think it's going to be, it depends on, where they are. But generally speaking, I think you have to take a look at the time to get to liftoff and how much money requires to get to liftoff. And in
And
the life
liftoff,
science,
is that a way of saying
that,
reducing the primary risk?
yeah, I guess when I say liftoff, I mean profitability and real growth.
I see.
Like ideally exponential type growth, growth where you take over a segment of the industry. And that's a hard conversation now for life science tools entrepreneurs because there's all this friction in the market for adoption, and so maybe the markets are slower and much more slowly adopting, and then you're burning cash until you get to that point. So and time. So it's very challenging, and I think entrepreneurs need to really think through how much time, how much money is it going to take until I can get to a place where I'm self-sustaining and growing nicely. And I think, if entrepreneurs take a hard-nosed look at that, there'd be a lot less competition in those spaces because the bar, is
Hmm.
really high. And then with less competition comes better outcomes for people, more capital available for the few that are doing things. So, so the advice I'd give to the entrepreneur is to be patient, but to recognize that it's going to be a long slog, and really,
Mm.
make sure you have super high conviction because you may have to play that conviction out over years of no love.
So if we're talking about long-term winners, I recall last time you were on the show, we were discussing biotech, and you talked about kind of long-term value creation and building franchises that are hard to displace. I'm curious, in 2025, what do you see as the pillars that sort of underpin a really successful franchise versus just one winning drug, for instance?
Yeah. Well, first, I think one winning drug can make for a very successful franchise. So
Fair enough.
I wouldn't
Fair enough.
discount the power of that. And, ultimately, the winners of every generation of any time are really defined by a single product
Hmm.
that drives, their growth. So I do think that there's no getting around. You need something that's best in class, best in the world, to sustain billions of dollars of value creation. Then, management obviously factors a lot into things. There's a lot of judgment calls, decisions that lead to that best in class product or that lead to something being almost best in class. And almost best in class is not best in class. And there's just a increasing spread these days between the winner and everybody else.
Mm.
So, I think it's a combination of having the right, hand and then playing the hand properly. So it's the, combination of the asset and the management team. Now the asset can be created the old fashioned way. And that's the vast majority of the assets that are, now in front of us, or it can be created, by a computer, who's developed the insights that humans haven't developed. And that's not yet, in front of us, but it's coming.
Jim, before we wrap, give us a prediction on GLP-1s, some sort of prognostication on maybe something non-obvious that you think may play out in that space over the next 3 to 5 years.
So first, I'm a big believer in GLP-1s. We were in that, sort of category, going back to 2012 when we first started.
Wow.
So we've been a huge believer in the category, and GLP-1 basically as a drug, it increases every cell in your body's insulin sensitivity. So it works not only on reducing fat, but it also works on making your liver more efficient and your kidney more efficient and your nerve cells more efficient. So I think it's being understood now that it's a general longevity product. It's a, excellent product at pushing your cells back to a younger state, so to speak, or a state where they process insulin like they used to. So I think there's a lot of upside, to the product. I think you're going to see orals come along. I think you're going to see it being used very pervasively in society. I think every bit as much as you see statins and metformin. So I think that this still has a long, long way to go in terms of its use. Now, on the downside, there are downsides for sure with any product, and nausea and diarrhea and constipation, depending upon which side of the side effects you're on, are all been reported with GLP-1s. There is muscle, sort of wasting that some people report. In particular, it can take fat out of places like your face. So, there's Ozempic face, so these are all, there's some cosmetic, downside to it, from a muscle point of view. You need to, really continue to push on your workouts if you're taking the product. There's one very long-term effect that has popped up through retrospective analysis, and that has to do with, I think it's macular degeneration risk. But the retrospective analyses are very, very hard because you can often get fooled, by statistics of random things when you look retrospectively. So that's something that's prospectively being looked at by regulators. But, the products have been on the market for quite some time. And if there is a signal for macular degeneration or whatever the optical issues, they're very, 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 very small signals. And then you have to weigh them against the benefit of reduced heart disease, cardiovascular outcomes superiority, which means you live longer on the product. And so I think the punchline is that GLP-1s are a product that helps us live longer and healthier. And there are some drawbacks, but they're really minor. And if there are more major drawbacks, they're going to be in a very, very small percent of the population. So, it's something that, always to keep an eye on. But I do think that over the next 3 to 5 years, you'll probably see just continued growth of the product category.
What percentage of the population do you think will be on GLP-1s in 5 years?
I think 20% of the population over 50.
Wow. It's already quite high.
Maybe that's high. Yeah, I was going to say maybe that's a little high, but 15, 20%. I think that's about right. Yeah.
Interesting. Jim, what book, article, or video would you recommend to listeners?
Well, I really enjoy the All In podcast, which is done by a friend of mine, David Sachs. So I'll put a plug for that. I listen to podcasts. I don't do as much reading as I should these days because I have so much technical reading that I end up doing every day.
Got it. Jim, do you have any habits or behaviors that are a secret weapon?
Well, I think I'm very persistent. And then I'm also very loyal. So I think those are good, sort of long range behaviors. I tend to have very, very long term relationships, that have lasted forever. I've been married for 33 years. I have my best friends I know from kindergarten. And so those would be
perfect.
So, all right.
And then last year, what's the best way for listeners to connect with you and follow along with Foresite?
Well, they can always look at our website. We do update it. I'm on LinkedIn. And I think those are probably the best ways.
Awesome. Well, he is Jim Tananbaum. The firm is Foresite. Jim, it was so much fun to run it back. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks for having me again. It was a pleasure.
Appreciate it.